There is a statistic that people rarely say out loud. Every third woman who has experienced domestic abuse names not her husband as the perpetrator, but someone from his family. Every third woman. And almost none of them were believed the first time. I was one of them. My name is Sarah. I am 28 years old, and what I am about to tell you is not someone's invention, not a screenplay. This is my life. A life that's split into before and after on one ordinary Tuesday in November, when wet snow fell outside the window. My husband was 300 kilometers away, and his father knocked on the bedroom door. I still remember that knock. 3 strikes. Quiet. Almost polite. It was precisely that politeness that was the most terrifying thing, because there was something calculated in it, something that could not be explained by coincidence. Daniel and I had been together for 3 years and married for 2. We lived in his parents' apartment, temporarily while we saved up for our own place. That's what Daniel always said. His father, Robert, occupied the upper floor of the split-level apartment. We had the lower floor. Between us was a staircase and one shared door that was never locked. I never thought about it. Why would I? It was family. That evening began ordinarily. Daniel called around 8, said his presentation had run long, that he would be back only on Friday. I made soup, watched something on television, showered, and went to bed around 11. I had almost fallen asleep when I heard footsteps on the stairs. Slow. Careful. The kind you don't make when you're simply going to the kitchen for water. 3 knocks on the door. I said, "Come in," because I didn't think. Because this was the home where I lived. Because the only person who could be behind that door was someone whose presence in my bedroom at 11:30 at night I had never imagined requiring an explanation. Robert entered. He was dressed. Jeans, a button-down shirt. His hair was combed. That, too, was not accidental, though I didn't understand it then. He said he saw the light under the door, that he was worried, that he wanted to make sure I was all right. I sat on the bed, the blanket pulled up to my chin, and looked at him. Something inside me had already tensed, that instinct women learn to ignore because there will always be someone nearby to say, "You're imagining things. You're being dramatic. You misunderstood." He sat on the edge of the bed. I hadn't invited him. He simply sat, as though he had a right to. He said I probably got lonely when Daniel was away, that it was hard to be alone, that he understood. His hand settled on the blanket beside my leg. I said I was tired and wanted to sleep. He didn't stand up. I said it again, clearer, louder. He looked at me the way one looks at a child who is being difficult, with that condescending smile that says, "You don't understand what's happening here, but I do." And he said a phrase I remember word for word to this day. He said, "You're too tense, Sarah. You need to relax." That was the beginning. Not the end, the beginning. What happened next, I will tell in detail. But first, you need to understand who this man was in my life before that night. Because that is precisely why everything that followed was so devastating. Not only what he did, but what came after. Because when I called my husband, he didn't believe me. But the court did. And before you hear the whole story, I want you to remember one thing. That night, I did not scream. I did not cry. I got out of the bed, opened the door, and told him to leave, in a voice that barely trembled. And while he walked down the stairs, I was already thinking about what I would do next. Not because I was ready, but because I had no other choice. This is the story of how one man decided he had the right, and how I proved he did not. Have you ever seen a house that looks perfect from the outside? A neat lawn, fresh paint, flowers and pots on the porch, but inside has rotting beams? On the surface, everything holds. Inside, it can collapse at any moment. Daniel's family was exactly that kind of house, and I lived in it for 2 years before I felt the floor give way beneath me. We met when I was 24. I was working as a manager at a small logistics company. He was a financial analyst. We were introduced through mutual friends. On our first date, he arrived 7 minutes late and brought an apology along with coffee. He had remembered that I drink an Americano without sugar, though I had mentioned it only in passing a week before. I thought, this man pays attention. That matters. His parents, Robert and Margaret, made an impression on me from the first meeting. A large apartment in a good neighborhood. A table set for 5 with napkins folded into triangles. Margaret had cooked herself. Roasted chicken with rosemary, a homemade apple pie. Robert opened a bottle of wine that was 20 years old and spoke about vintages with such expertise that I felt slightly provincial. He was charming, a broad-shouldered man in his mid-50s with a confident handshake and a voice that filled the room without ever raising in volume. That voice was the one I should have registered as a warning sign. I didn't. He and Daniel were alike. The same manner of speaking, measured, with pauses in the right places. The same habit of tilting the head slightly when listening. The same smile that never quite reaches the eyes. I took it for a family trait. Reserve, refinement. I didn't understand then that it had another name. Control. Carefully cultivated, passed down from father to son. The first signal I ignored came at the 3-month mark of our relationship. Robert had come to visit. Daniel was renting a small studio at the time, and I was making dinner. Just pasta. Robert walked into the kitchen, stood beside me, looked at what I was doing, and said, "You're very domestic." It was a compliment. I smiled. But then he added, "Daniel knows how to choose." He said it the way one speaks of a purchase, approvingly, assessingly. I felt something slippery in those words. I pushed the feeling aside. It's just a compliment, I told myself. Older generations express themselves differently. The second signal came 6 months after the wedding. We were already living in their apartment. Margaret had gone to visit her sister for a week. Robert suggested we have dinner together while Daniel stayed late at work. He set the table, poured wine. Over dinner, he asked if I was happy with Daniel. I said, "Yes, of course." He was quiet for a moment and then said, "That's good. Young women often don't know what they want. What a woman really needs," a pause, "is the right man beside her." I decided he was talking about Daniel. I wanted to decide that, because the other explanation was too uncomfortable. The third signal I could no longer ignore. But even then, I didn't call it by the right name. It happened in the summer, at the dacha. Robert hugged me when we arrived. Nothing unusual. They all hugged on arrival. But his hands lingered a few seconds longer than necessary. His palms, slightly lower than they should have been. When I stepped back, he looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't name then. I can now. It was a test. He was testing how I would react. I told Daniel about it that same night. Carefully, without accusations. I said, "You know, I had a strange feeling today when your father..." and didn't finish. Daniel laughed, quietly, almost in disbelief. He said, "Sarah, that's my father. Are you serious? You're overthinking it." I went quiet and stayed quiet for another year and a half. Do you understand what is most destructive about families like this? Not that they contain a bad person, but that everyone else is tuned to his frequency. Margaret saw what she wanted to see. Daniel saw the father he was proud of. And I saw everything and told myself, "You're misunderstanding. You haven't been in this family long enough to judge." This is called gaslighting. Not the kind one person does deliberately, but the kind a whole system does, quietly, habitually, every day, until you yourself begin to doubt what you see with your own eyes. That November night was not a coincidence. It was a finale, the logical conclusion of everything that had been building for years. Glances, phrases, touches that I had each time explained away in his favor. Now, I was explaining nothing in his favor anymore. Now, I was writing things down. Do you know what happens to a person who lives under prolonged tension while convincing themselves that everything is fine? They start to adapt. The tension becomes background noise. The anxiety becomes normal. You stop noticing something is wrong because that something has become part of your life. That was exactly the state I was in every time Daniel left for a trip. That time he left on Monday morning. A conference in another city, a finance summit, 3 days, back on Thursday. We stood in the hallway. He was putting on his jacket, and I was holding his travel mug of coffee, the one he always forgot to grab himself. That was our ritual. A quick kiss, the mug handed over, the bag on his shoulder. I almost told him then. Almost. The words were already in my throat. "Daniel, I don't want to be left alone here with your father. I'm uncomfortable. I'm scared. And I don't know how to explain it to you, because every time I've tried, you've laughed it off." I said nothing. He kissed me on the temple and walked out. I stood in the hallway for another 3 minutes, just stood there, looking at the closed door. The first day was quiet. Robert left early in the morning. He had some sort of business lunch. Margaret, as usual, was visiting a friend in the afternoon. I worked from home, made calls, answered emails, cooked soup for lunch. An ordinary day. I almost convinced myself the fears were just fears. On the second day, Robert came home early. I heard him coming up the stairs. He had a particular gait with a small creak on the third step. I had grown used to that sound, the way one grows used to a creaking floorboard in an old house. You hear it and don't think about it. You simply register it. But that day, he stopped outside our door. He knocked, said through the door that he had bought something for dinner and asked whether I'd like to eat together. I said I had work, that I'd eat later. He said, "Of course, I understand," and went away. I heard him cooking, the clinking of dishes, the smell of fried onion. Then silence. Then the television. I convinced myself that was the end of it. It was not the end. On the third day, Tuesday, closer to midnight, I had already gone to bed. I was lying there, reading something on my phone, when I heard those footsteps. Slow, careful. The creak on the third step. 3 knocks on the door. Here is what I need you to understand. Between the first knock and what happened next, only a few minutes passed. But they were the longest minutes of my life. Because part of me, the part that had been ignoring signals for 2 years, was still saying, "This is fine. He's just checking. He's worried. This is family." but another part of me already knew. When he came in and sat on the edge of the bed, I didn't wait. I said it directly. "Robert, it's late. I want to sleep. Please leave." He looked at me with that expression, condescending, as though speaking to a child, and said quietly, "Sarah, don't make a scene." He reached his hand toward my shoulder. I got up. I literally got out of bed on the far side, away from him, and said, "Don't touch me." Loudly, clearly. Something changed in his face. Not fear, no. Something colder. He stood up slowly, smoothed his shirt, and said, "You're misunderstanding everything." Then he left. I locked the door. Our bedroom had no lock, but there was a wooden chair back that could be wedged under the handle. I did that. Then I sat down on the bed. My hands were trembling. I didn't cry. I think I was too shaken to cry. I sat and thought about one thing. What do I do now? Not about Robert, about Daniel. Because telling my husband meant breaking something that already stood on a rotten foundation. And saying nothing meant accepting that this was normal. I picked up my phone, found Daniel's contact, pressed call. While I waited for him to answer, I stared at the wooden chair back wedged under the door handle and thought, I was right to get up. I was right to say, "Don't touch me." Whatever happens next, that part I did right. He answered after the fourth ring. Groggy voice, slightly irritated. "Sarah, it's almost midnight. What happened?" I opened my mouth and suddenly realized I didn't know which word to start with. Because there are no right words for what I was about to say. There is no sentence that doesn't land like a blow. No beginning that doesn't change everything that came before it. But I said it. I said all of it. And that was only the beginning of the hardest part. Research tells us 70% of women who have experienced harassment from a partner's relatives stay silent. Not for a year or two, for years, sometimes a lifetime. Not because they don't want to speak, but because they already know what they'll hear. I was in the 30% who decided to speak up. And I can tell you exactly, it didn't make everything easier. It just made everything different. Daniel answered after the fourth ring. His voice was groggy, slightly irritated. I could feel I had woken him. He said, "Sarah, what happened? It's almost midnight." I began to speak. Slowly, because my voice wasn't cooperating. I told him what had happened that evening. That Robert had come into our bedroom, that he had sat on the bed, that he had reached toward me, that I had gotten up and told him to leave. That he did, but only after I had demanded it loudly enough. On the other end, there was silence. A long silence. The kind in which you can hear your own breathing. Then Daniel asked, "You're saying my father came into the room?" I said, "Yes, that is exactly what I'm saying." Silence again. And then, and this I will remember for the rest of my life, he made a short sound. Not a laugh, something between a laugh and an exhale. As though what I was saying was so absurd it didn't warrant a full response. And he said, "Sarah, are you serious? It's Dad. He's in his 50s. He probably just wanted to make sure you were okay." I said, "Daniel, he sat on our bed. He put his hand beside my leg. When I told him to go, he said, 'Don't make a scene.'" A pause. He said, "You're probably just tired, or you had a bad dream." That's not like him. That That's not like him, was the blow I hadn't expected. Not because it was cruel, but because it was sincere. Daniel wasn't saying it to defend his father deliberately. He was saying it because he genuinely believed it. Because he had no other Robert, only the one he had known his entire life. The father who taught him to ride a bike, who sat in the stands at every game, who helped with the down payment on a car. That man could not have done what I was describing. Daniel's mind simply could not process it. I understood that. And at the same time, I resented that understanding. Because my pain did not diminish just because I understood where his disbelief was coming from. I said, "Daniel, I didn't imagine this. I'm not tired. I'm calling you at midnight, asking you to believe me." He was quiet. Then said, in a voice that already carried exhaustion, "I'll talk to him when I get back, okay? But Sarah, don't make this into more than it is. Dad can be pushy sometimes, I know that. But it's not what you think it is." I held the phone to my ear for several more seconds after the call ended. Then I put it down. I sat on the bed. The wooden chair back was still wedged under the door handle. Behind the wall was silence. No footsteps in the corridor. The wet snow outside the window had stopped. There was that particular nighttime quiet when the whole world seems to pause and wait. For what? You can't tell. I kept thinking one thing. I had just been told I'd misunderstood. For the second time that evening, the first time by Robert, the second by my husband. And it was then that I made a decision. Not an emotional one, not driven by fear. Quiet, cold, very clear. I picked up my phone again and opened the Notes app. I wrote, November 24th, time, 11:45 p.m. And then, everything I could remember. What he had said, what he had done, how he had looked, what he was wearing, how long he had stayed in the room, his exact words. I wrote for about half an hour. Date, time, details. That was the first document of the many that would later go into the case folder. I didn't know then that there would be many more. I just wrote, because I knew, if I don't write it down, they'll say I invented it. And this time, I intended to be prepared. I put the phone away, lay down. Didn't sleep until dawn. But the chair under the door handle? I didn't move it. What happens when the accused and his main defender live under the same roof, and that defender is your husband? I'll tell you what happens. You find yourself in a situation where the truth exists, the evidence exists, the pain exists, and still, no one believes you. Daniel returned on Thursday evening. I heard the front door slam, heard him coming up past the same third step that now crept into my nightmares. He walked into our room with a travel bag on his shoulder, set it by the wardrobe, and said, "Hey." Just hey, as if there had been no phone call between us. As if I had told him nothing. I was sitting at the desk with my laptop, pretending to work. I looked up, watched him, waited. He held a pause for about 5 seconds, then said, "I talked to Dad." I asked, "And what did he say?" Daniel lowered his head slightly, picked up the keys from the table, just to have something to do with his hands, I could see that, and said slowly, "He says he just came to check whether you needed anything, that you misunderstood his intentions, that he didn't want you to be alone and worried." I said, "Daniel." He sat down on our bed. He put his hand on the blanket beside my leg. He told me to relax and don't make a scene. That is not checking whether I need help. Daniel looked at me. There was something in that look I hate to remember. Not anger. Worse. Exhaustion. The exhaustion of a person being asked to believe something they very much do not want to believe. He said, "Sarah, Dad isn't that kind of person." I said, "You already said that, the night I called you." And still, it was exactly that. He was quiet, then said, "Maybe you're taking things too hard. You get stressed when I'm away. You know that about yourself." I felt not anger, something colder than anger, something resembling an understanding of how this would look in the future if I did nothing. The next morning, Robert behaved as though nothing had happened. He came into the kitchen at 7, started the coffee, nodded at me with a pleasant smile, and asked whether I wanted pancakes. He made them on Sunday mornings. He was courteous. He was charming. He was exactly who he always was in front of people. That was almost worse than everything else, because it was precisely this calm, this normalcy, that made me look, in everyone else's eyes, like the unstable one. He looked like a normal person. I looked like someone who had manufactured a scandal out of nothing. That same day, I heard Margaret crying in the kitchen, quietly into her hands. Then she came out to me and said, very calmly, very politely, that she didn't understand what I wanted to do to this family. That Robert had been a good father and a good husband his whole life. That she hoped I wasn't going to blow things out of proportion. The word blow things out of proportion. I filed it away. I understood then what was happening. No one was trying to convince me I was lying. They were trying to convince me I was exaggerating. That's more subtle, more insidious. Because when someone tells you you're lying, you can resist. But when someone tells you you're exaggerating, it destroys you from the inside. You begin to doubt yourself. That evening I packed a small bag. Not everything, just the essentials. Documents, laptop, medication. I called my friend, Jennifer. We'd been close since university. I asked whether I could come over. She said, "Right now?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Come." Daniel stood in the bedroom doorway watching me pack. He asked, "What are you doing?" I said, "Leaving for a few days." He asked, "Where?" I said, "To Jennifer's." He was quiet, then said softly, "Sarah, please don't do this. You're making everything more complicated." I zipped up the bag, picked up my phone, looked at him. I said, "I'm not making things complicated. I'm protecting myself. If you were doing that, I wouldn't be going anywhere." I walked out without looking back. It was cold outside, late November, that moment when autumn finally surrenders to winter. I stood outside the building waiting for the cab. My hands weren't trembling. I noticed that my hands weren't trembling, and thought, so this is what it feels like. When you make the right decision. Not the easy one. The right one. The cab came in 8 minutes. I left. That was the first day of the real fight. The one that would go on for a long time. Through lawyers, through court, through divorce. But that first step, walking out that door with a bag in my hand, was perhaps the most important. Because that was the moment I stopped waiting for someone else to protect me. There are things you only understand when you step outside a situation. When you leave the room where people have been convincing you that you misread reality, and suddenly see that reality from the other side. That is what happened to me at Jennifer's. She lived in a small two-bedroom apartment on the 5th floor. An ordinary apartment. IKEA furniture, a coffee machine, a cat named Chester who immediately climbed into my lap the moment I sat down on the sofa. I held that cat and thought, this is normal. This is what it should feel like, to be in someone else's home and feel safe. Jennifer put the kettle on. Didn't ask anything, just put it on. Brought 2 mugs and sat across from me. Looked at me. I said, I need to tell you something. She said, I'm listening. And I told her. Everything. From the very beginning. The first warning signs. That summer evening at the dacha. That November night. The phone call to Daniel. His return. Margaret's tears. The word blow things out of proportion. I spoke for a long time. Probably an hour. Sometimes I lost the thread. Sometimes I went quiet and took a sip of tea. Jennifer didn't interrupt. Only once, when I got to the part where Daniel said, You're probably just tired. She said softly, My God, Sarah. That was exactly what I needed. Not advice, not a plan. Just for someone to say, I hear you, and this is not okay. Then she asked, What are you going to do? I answered honestly, I don't know. Part of me wants to forget it and go back. Part of me understands that if I go back, nothing will change. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something I remember exactly. Sarah, when someone does something like this, it's never the first time. People like that don't start suddenly. They've been practicing. You're just the first one who didn't stay silent. That sentence changed something inside me. Not because it made everything clear, but because it gave me a different frame. I stopped thinking, what did I do wrong? And started thinking, what do I do right now? In the first days at Jennifer's, I barely left the apartment. I sat with my laptop, answered work emails, pretended everything was normal. Daniel called every day. The first 2 calls, worried, soft, asking, when are you coming back? The third, already with a slight edge of irritation. The fourth, with the phrase, Dad is very upset. He doesn't understand what you want from him. I asked Daniel not to call for a few days. He disagreed. He kept calling. On the 5th day at Jennifer's, I opened my notes and reread what I had written that November night. Date, time, words, details. All of it was recorded in my own hand. Well, typed on my phone, and it looked detached, like someone else's story, like a police report. That thought is what gave me the idea. I began researching. Quietly, without making noise. Opening tabs, reading, closing them. What harassment means in legal terms. What can be proven. What cannot. What the time frames are. What the word witness means in cases like this. And then, I remembered Nora. Nora, the neighbor on the upper floor. An elderly woman, retired, living alone. She had a habit of sitting on her small balcony with a book almost every evening, even in cool weather. Our balcony faced the same side of the building. The distance between us, maybe 15 meters, no more. That evening, when Robert came upstairs, I remembered. Nora had been on her balcony. I had seen the glow of her reading lamp when I looked out the window shortly before going to bed. She might have seen the light in our window. She might have seen him go up. She might have seen something else. I texted her. We had each other's numbers. We occasionally messaged about packages. I asked whether she might be willing to talk with me, in person, not over the phone. She replied within half an hour. "Of course, Sarah. Come whenever it's convenient." The next day I went to see her. Not to Robert and Margaret's apartment, to Nora's. We sat at her kitchen table with coffee, and I very carefully, very gently asked, "Do you remember the evening of November 24th? Were you on the balcony then?" She looked at me for a long moment, then said, "I remember. I saw Robert go up to your apartment. It was already late. I remember thinking, why at that hour? Then I saw him come back down. You opened the window for a few seconds, and I heard you speaking. Not the words, just the voices. And your voice sounded tense." My breath caught. I said, "Nora, would you be willing to give a statement about this, if it came to that?" She placed her hand over mine, looked at me directly. She said, "Sarah, I've lived 72 years. I've seen a great deal. If what I think happened, then I will speak. Not one word less, and not one word more. But I will speak." That was the first moment I felt, I have a chance. I went back to Jennifer's, opened my laptop, and wrote an email to a lawyer. The lawyer told me something at our first meeting, something that took my breath away, not from fear, but from how easily she said it, the way you might mention the weather. She said, "You know, Sarah, we see far more cases like yours than people realize. It's just that almost all of them end in silence." Her name was Claire, a small woman in her mid-40s, short dark hair, glasses on a chain that she never actually wore. She only held them in her hands or turned them between her fingers when she was thinking. She specialized in domestic violence and sexual harassment cases. Her office was on the third floor of an ordinary business center. No frills, plain furniture, stacks of folders on the shelves, a small window looking out onto a courtyard. That plainness was what calmed me. I had been afraid I would feel like I was already in court before anything had even begun. But it felt more like a doctor's office. An appointment, an examination, a diagnosis, no judgment. She listened to me for 40 minutes, didn't interrupt, didn't take notes on paper, only watched. Occasionally, she asked a brief clarifying question. What time was it? What exactly did he say? Are you sure the door was closed? When I finished, she was quiet for about 10 seconds. Then she said, "All right, let's look at what we have." Here is what we had. First, my own records, the notes in my phone, made that same night. The timestamp is automatic. That matters, Claire explained. Courts trust records made immediately after an event because they're harder to fabricate on demand. Second, Nora's testimony. The neighbor who had seen Robert go up at a late hour and heard my voice. Third, and this was something I hadn't expected to be significant, the messenger exchange. Specifically, a message Robert had sent me the morning after that night. A short message. He wrote, "I hope you got some good rest." No reference to what had happened, just, "I hope you got some good rest." As though everything had been perfectly fine. Claire said, "That's valuable. A person with a clear conscience doesn't write messages like that. Messages like that are written by people who know they've done something and are trying to create the appearance of normalcy." I looked at her and thought, so this is what a professional eye looks like, applied to something I couldn't find the right words for myself. Then she asked about my husband. I told her about the phone call, his words, the fact that he believed his father over me. Claire listened without expression, then said, "That complicates things, but it doesn't break the case. If he testifies for the defense, that's expected. Courts understand family dynamics." Family dynamics. I filed that phrase away. It was another frame. Professional, cold, without emotion. And precisely that kind of frame was what I needed right now. Then Claire asked what I had been waiting for and dreading simultaneously. "Do you understand that this will be public? That his name and your name will be in the case materials? That the family will know everything? That this will likely lead to a divorce?" I said, "I understand." She looked at me for a few seconds, then said, "Good. Then we'll begin." The next 3 weeks were the most intense of my life. Claire built the case carefully, methodically. We met twice a week. She explained every step, why this particular document mattered, why the wording of the statement needed to be exactly this way, what the opposing attorney would try to do, and how I should respond. He hired a lawyer quickly. Robert did. An expensive one, with a reputation. That too was informative, Claire said. People with clean consciences don't hire expensive lawyers immediately. They say first, "This is a misunderstanding. It will sort itself out." Robert didn't say that. Robert retained a lawyer within 3 days. I asked Claire sometimes, "Will we win?" She gave the same answer each time. "I don't know. Nobody knows. But we have enough to be heard. And that is already something." That phrase was what I held on to. Not "we'll win," not "everything will be fine," simply "we will be heard." During all those weeks, Daniel called me once, not to ask how I was, but to say, "Do you understand that you're destroying this family?" I replied briefly, "I'm not destroying the family, Daniel. I'm protecting myself from a man who violated my boundaries in our home. If that's destroying the family, it means the foundation was weak long before I came into it." He didn't respond. I put my phone away and went back to working with Claire. The hearing date was set. February. 3 months since that November night. 3 months, from a wooden chairback wedged under a door handle to a courtroom. I thought about that sometimes at night, about how short that distance was, and how long it took to cross it. If you think that walking into a courtroom is frightening because of the judge or the legal proceedings, you're wrong. The most frightening part is walking in and seeing him there, alive, in an expensive suit, with the expression of a man being subjected to an undeserved accusation. Robert sat on the bench on the opposite side. A dark navy suit, white shirt, freshly shaved. Beside him, his attorney, a man around 50 with a leather briefcase and the bearing of someone who had won cases worse than this one. Robert sat straight. He didn't look in my direction, or he did, but in a way that made it seem like he wasn't. A professional in the art of denial. I walked in with Claire. We took our seats at our table. I placed my hands on the surface and made them stay still. And then I saw Daniel. He was sitting in the gallery, not beside his father, not beside me. In the middle, on the public bench, in a gray sweater, with the look of someone who had been brought here against his will and hadn't yet decided which side he was on. Or had already decided and was ashamed of it. Our eyes met for a second. He looked away first. The session began. Robert's attorney worked professionally and without mercy. His strategy was clear from the first minutes: undermine my credibility. Not a frontal attack, too risky. Just ask questions in a way that made my answers sound vague. He asked, "Are you certain about the exact time? Couldn't you have misjudged his intentions? Do you acknowledge that Robert always treated you as a member of the family? Do you acknowledge that during that period, your marriage was experiencing difficulties?" Claire had prepared me for every one of these questions. I answered clearly, briefly, without excess. Yes. No. Absolutely. I don't accept that interpretation. Every time I began to drift into explanation, Claire would give a slight nod, and I would return to a short answer. Then Nora's testimony was read into the record. She hadn't been able to attend in person due to her health, but her written statement had been notarized. The judge read it aloud in a level, unemotional voice, that particular voice that makes any words heavier, because behind it there is no intonation, only meaning. Nora had written, "On November 24th, at approximately 11:30 p.m., I observed Robert going up the staircase in the direction of his son's apartment. The light in that apartment's window was on. Approximately 20 to 25 minutes later, he came back down. During a brief interval, I heard a woman's voice, strained, raised, from a window that was opened for a few seconds. After that, the window closed. The room was quiet." Robert's attorney asked whether the witness's reliability could be challenged. An elderly woman, a dark hour, the distance involved. Claire objected. The testimony is corroborated by the time interval, which matches the complainant's own records. The judge sustained the objection. Then, the phone call recording. I hadn't known this was possible, that a recording could be obtained through the carrier with a court order. Claire knew. She had obtained a portion of Daniel's call that night. Not all of it, only the part where my voice could be heard. Steady, slightly breaking, but clear. I was telling him what had happened. His voice in response. And that phrase, "You're probably just tired," or "You had a bad dream." When those words played in the courtroom, from an actual phone call, in real time from that night, I looked at Daniel. He was staring at the floor. Robert's attorney tried to interpret the recording differently. This is a normal reaction from a tired man who doesn't understand what his wife is saying. This is not an admission of his client's guilt. Claire objected. This demonstrates a pattern. The complainant was not heard. Her words were dismissed. She was denied support, which in itself forms part of the context. By the end of the first day of hearings, my head ached the way it never had before. Not from stress, from concentration. I listened to every word, tracked every gesture, remembered. Claire and I stepped into the corridor during a break. She poured me water from the dispenser. I drank it. She said only one thing. "You're holding up well. Keep going." I nodded, looked toward the end of the corridor. Daniel was standing there, alone, without his father, without any lawyer. Just standing by the window looking at the street. His shoulders were lowered. I didn't know what was happening inside him. Perhaps he was only beginning to understand then. The second day of hearings was shorter and harsher. Robert's attorney called him as a witness. Robert gave his testimony calmly, with composure, precisely the way people testify when they know how to manage impressions. He said he had come to check on her, that he was concerned about his daughter-in-law, that she had misunderstood him, that they had always had warm, family relations. Then, Claire asked him one question. Just one. She asked, "Do you remember what you wrote to Sarah the morning after that evening?" He said, "Not exactly." Claire submitted the screenshot of the message into evidence. She read it aloud. "I hope you got some good rest." Then she asked, "If you were simply checking on her and nothing happened, Why did you write this message? What, specifically, were you hoping she had rested well from? Robert was silent for 5 seconds. Then he answered, "Just being polite." Claire said, "Thank you. I have no further questions." I watched her and thought, this is what skill looks like. Not loud words. One question, and the silence that follows it says more than any answer. The ruling was to be announced in 2 weeks. I walked out of the courtroom into a gray February day, cold air, bare trees, a sky the color of concrete. I stood on the steps and simply breathed. Claire came out behind me. She said, "We did what we could. Now we wait." I said, "Thank you." That was the only word I had. She nodded, and we went our separate ways. What do you think a person feels when justice finally speaks their name? I thought about it for 2 weeks, while waiting for the decision. I thought it would be relief, or joy, or triumph, something loud and enormous. It turned out to be something entirely different. 2 weeks of waiting is its own kind of torment. I worked, ate, slept, talked with Jennifer, went for walks. Lived, in other words. But inside, the whole time, there was a taut string. One call from Claire, and it could ring out or snap. Daniel called me 3 days before the ruling was announced. Not with threats, not with accusations. He simply asked how I was. A quiet call, brief. I said, "Fine." He said, "I understand you've been through a great deal." I said, "Yes." He was quiet, then said, "I'm sorry I didn't believe you right away." I didn't know what to say. It was the first time he had said something real. Not, "You're exaggerating." Not, "You're tired." Not, "Don't make a scene out of this." Just, "I'm sorry." I said, "I hear you." That was all I could say. The call from Claire came on Wednesday morning. Brief. "The decision is ready. The session is at 2 p.m. I put on the same coat I had worn the first day of the trial. Not deliberately, it was just the first thing I reached for. I picked up my bag. I left. There weren't many of us in the room. Claire, myself, Robert with his attorney. The attorney looked more tense than usual. I noticed that, which meant he knew something, or sensed it. Robert sat with the same straight spine, the same expression, as though what was about to happen had nothing to do with him. Daniel sat in the gallery, in the middle again, this time in a black jacket. The judge entered. Everyone stood, sat. The judge began reading the decision, in official language, with qualifications, in legal formulations that I heard but didn't immediately fully parse. Claire kept her hand on the table, beside mine, not touching, but there. Then I heard the word, credible. The court found the complainant's testimony credible. The court classified the respondent's actions as sexual harassment. The court ordered. What followed were formulations about liability, about measures, about a no-contact order. I heard them, filed them away. But the most important word remained the first one. Credible. I had been heard. After 2 nights during which I was told, "You misunderstood." After the phone call where I was told, "You're tired." After, "Don't make a scene and blow things out of proportion." After all of that, the court read what I had typed on my phone at midnight on November 24th and said, "Yes, that is exactly what happened." I didn't cry. That surprised me. I thought I would. Instead, I simply exhaled. Slowly, for a long time, as though I had been holding air for several months. Claire gripped my wrist for a moment, then let go. Robert said something to his attorney, quietly, I couldn't hear. The attorney replied even more quietly. Robert didn't look broken. He looked like a man whose plans had suddenly changed. Anger without panic. Calculation without admission. We walked out into the corridor, and then I saw Daniel. He was standing against the wall, hands in pockets, gaze on the floor. When I walked past, he looked up. His eyes were red. He wasn't crying now, but had been earlier. That was clear. He said, quietly, almost in a whisper, "Sarah." I stopped. He said, "I don't know what to say now." I looked at him, at this man I had lived with for 2 years, who had taught me to make coffee in a chesve, who sang in the shower thinking I couldn't hear, who had loved me, I believe that, but couldn't place that love above his loyalty to his father. I said, "Then don't say anything. Just know that I heard you during that late-night call when you asked for forgiveness. That matters. But it isn't enough." He nodded, very slowly. I walked on. On the courthouse steps, there was cold February sunlight. Not warm, just bright, the kind that illuminates without warming. I raised my face toward it, stood like that for about 30 seconds. Claire came out behind me. She said, "What now?" I said, "Now, I live." There is a question I asked myself a year ago, that November night, sitting with a wooden chair back wedged under the door handle, typing a note on my phone with a date and a time. I asked myself, will you be able to handle this? Honestly, will you? Now I know the answer. 9 months have passed since the trial. I live in a small apartment on the 2nd floor that I rent on my own. 2 rooms, a large window in the bedroom that looks out onto an old tree in the courtyard. That tree is the first thing I see every morning. I chose the apartment specifically for that window. After everything that happened, I needed to see the sky when I woke up. The first month after the trial was simultaneously easy and very hard. Easy because the main source of pressure was gone. Hard because when pressure lifts, you suddenly feel everything that had been underneath it. The exhaustion you hadn't noticed. The fear that had long become habit. Grief for the marriage, for the family that turned out not to exist, for the person Daniel could have become, but didn't. We finalized the divorce 3 months after the ruling, without a scene, without court in the sense of without a second court. Just papers, signatures, a date. Daniel came to the notary's office neatly dressed, looking gaunt. We barely said a word. Only when we were leaving, he held the door. It was the last small courtesy. Small, but genuine. I've kept it. I see a therapist every Friday. Her name is Dr. Monica. A small office, a sofa, a tree visible through the window, almost like my own place at home. The first few sessions, I barely said anything. I just sat and adjusted to the idea that this space was safe, that I wouldn't be interrupted, that my words wouldn't be used against me. It sounds strange, adjusting to safety, but that's exactly how it works. Gradually, I began to speak about that night, about the years before it, about the signals I had ignored. Dr. Monica asks questions, not to provide answers, but so that I find them myself. It's a slow process, sometimes uncomfortable, but it works. One of the main realizations I've had in therapy, I was always looking for permission. permission to be right, permission to be angry, permission to leave, permission not to forgive, as though my feelings needed someone's signature to become valid. The court gave me that signature, and at the same time, I understood I should never have had to wait for it. My feelings were valid from that first night when I said, "Don't touch me." I just didn't know it yet. Robert received a suspended sentence and a no-contact order. His attorney filed an appeal. Claire said this is standard procedure, and the odds of it succeeding are low. Margaret moved to her sister's. I learned this accidentally, through mutual acquaintances. They separated. Perhaps she, too, came to understand something. Perhaps she simply needed somewhere to go. I don't know. This is no longer my story. Jennifer is still my best friend. We meet once a week, sometimes at a cafe, sometimes just for a walk. She doesn't ask, "How are you holding up?" She asks, "What's been interesting lately?" That's an important difference. She treats me as a person who is living, not a person who is surviving. Nora sent me a letter, a real one, on paper. Very short. It said, "I'm glad you found the strength. I've stayed silent too many times in my life about too many things. I'm glad that this time, staying silent wasn't possible." That letter sits on my shelf. I went back to work, fully, without sick leave or pauses. I even got a small promotion in November. That's almost funny, that it was November. Exactly a year later.
I noted it quietly to myself, without reading too much into it. Just registered it.
A year ago, I was sitting in someone else's bedroom with trembling hands. Now I'm signing a promotion agreement. The same me, a different year. Sometimes people ask, friends, colleagues, sometimes people who have heard the story, whether I regret anything. I think about it honestly each time, and each time I arrive at the same answer. I don't regret calling Daniel that night, even though he didn't believe me. I don't regret leaving for Jennifer's, even though it felt like an enormous step. I don't regret going to Claire, even though I was afraid. There is one thing I do regret. That I spent so long convincing myself that the signals weren't signals, that the discomfort was my imagination, that the anxiety was my excess sensitivity. It cost me time. A lot of time. I can't get it back. But I can use what remains. There is something I only understood after all of this. Silence is not neutrality. When you say nothing about what is happening to you, you are not protecting yourself. You are protecting the person who caused you harm. You are giving them time. You are giving them space. You are giving them the next opportunity. I don't do that anymore. If you are listening to this and recognize something of yourself in it, in the signals you explained away in someone else's favor, in the nights when you put a chair against the door, in the phone calls where you told the truth and heard you're just tired. If you recognize yourself, I want you to know what you felt was real. What was happening to you was not normal. And silence is not your obligation. I didn't expect the trial to change me. I didn't expect a judge's ruling to make me a different person. But something changed. Not loudly, quietly. Like something that had been held tightly clenched for a long time, finally released. One morning, after the trial, already in the new apartment, I woke up and for the first few seconds remembered nothing bad. I just lay there, looking at the tree outside the window. A bird sat on a branch, then flew away. I watched it go. That was the first morning that belonged only to me. And there have been more mornings like that since. My name is Sarah. I am 28 years old. I went through this, and I am here. Thank you for listening until the end. Like if this story touched you. Subscribe if you want to hear more.